think when you've had an issue for 20 or 30 years and when it's kind of been a little bit crazy and hard and tumultuous, it makes what we would maybe call like constitution or like sensitivity, it makes you more fragile, I feel like.
Welcome to the Healthy Skin Show with Jennifer Fugo, where we're flipping everything you've been told about your chronic skin issues upside down and connecting you with alternative solutions your dermatologist never told you about.
Welcome to episode number 42 of the Healthy Skin Show. On today's show, we're going to be talking about sulfur and sulfur metabolism and how that can impact your skin. And if you're like, ugh, this sounds boring, it's actually not. And one of the reasons why is this is a very difficult issue to pick up on. And my guest today is going to share her experience with that. The reason that I wanted to have the conversation is that oftentimes when you have chronic skin issues like I did, you just want like obvious, very quick answers because you're suffering so much. You're hoping that any person or practitioner that you see or work with is just going to pick it out easily, find this one thing you can do, and it's going to fix everything. And unfortunately, for a lot of us, that's not always the case. It involves a lot of hard work. It also can be a lot of trial and error. And that's one of the big pieces to this, of realizing that there can oftentimes be layers of work that needs to be done on your system. That it's not just one pill, one supplement, one dietary tweak, and all will be resolved. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. And the reason is that it really depends on a variety of factors, like your genes, your microbiomes, your nutrient status, environmental exposures, allergies, hormones, trauma, etc. We've talked a lot about how you can have this constellation of root causes that makes your particular rashes and the way that you're going to dig yourself out of that scenario different from someone else. The common question that I get is, well, Jen, how did you get rid of your eczema? And I'm a little reluctant to answer that question with incredible detail because I know exactly what they want. They want to know what I did so they can do that too and get the same results. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Because if their constellation of root causes is different than mine, what I did to resolve my skin issues is not likely going to work for them. It might get them somewhere further down the line, closer to healthier skin, but it doesn't guarantee that their issues will resolve in the same way that mine did. Because again, the root causes are different. And I also wanted to make one point before we dive into this conversation. I've had some clients who've come to me recently with sudden onsets of their issues. Like all of a sudden, out of the blue, I had these rashes. I've never had them before. I was pretty healthy. I have no idea what happened. It's like a flip got switched. And now I can't seem to turn it off. I'm often asked, how did we get here? How did this happen? And unfortunately, the answer tends to be more complicated than we'd like it to be. It's not that you ate one food or you went on a trip in this one place or you did this one thing differently. Oftentimes, there were subtle clues underneath all of the daily activity and the daily experiences that we have that are either very subtle and difficult to pinpoint, or they're things that you would just blow off. I mean, maybe with time you were getting increasingly tired, for example, but you didn't notice it because it was such a minute amount every single month that it felt normal. However, there can be instances where there is a really significant change. For example, one of my clients suddenly developed a really intense, severe allergic reaction while traveling overseas many years ago. And then fast forward a number of years and then developed eczema after a camping trip. It turned out that he had some hidden infections that had been lingering in his system for, well, we're not really sure how long. We're not sure whether they came from the initial trip which triggered the allergic reactions that have stayed, or if they came later on or were exacerbated by the camping trip years later. Either way, that hidden root cause has been such a big deal for this particular client. I talked in the previous episode number 41, all about looking for root cause triggers, identifying symptoms, getting very clear on what has happened to you. Your timeline of your health is just as important as the symptoms you experience in your daily life. You cannot ignore the things that you have experienced, even if they go back 60 years or 70 years. And that's why I say that some issues tend to be more complex than others. And when we don't have all of the information in front of us, or we're dismissive of things that seem normal or should be normal experiences, we can sometimes miss clues that help point us down very particular pathways. And that ultimately the goal is that those paths lead to identifying root causes so that we can then begin addressing them. Now, today's conversation around sulfur is one that's complicated. There is no test at this moment that you can use in order to really, truly understand sulfur metabolism, at least from a more functional standpoint. And when there is one, I'll let you know. But my guest today has had experience in dealing with some of these complicated skin cases just as I have, and she wanted to share about the sulfur issue that oftentimes is overlooked. And to be honest, this is an issue that I have been researching for a number of months because it is also tied into your ability to process salicylates. We're going to talk a whole lot about this, so I don't want to go in depth here. I just wanted to let you know that it's not abnormal for cases to be complicated. And sometimes they are, and you can't just give up when the road ahead isn't as smooth and easy as you would like it to be. Everybody would love an easy path, but sometimes we've got to roll up our sleeves and dig. And that's all we can do. And hopefully when you're in a relationship with a practitioner, that you are co-pilots together and that you work in tandem with your practitioners to figure out what the heck is going on and then what steps to intelligently take to move forward. All right, without further ado, let's dive into today's interview. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Healthy Skin Show. Today I've got a guest with me. I'm very excited to continue extrapolating upon this conversation that we had a number of episodes ago with Lily Mazzarella. And we'll put that podcast in the show notes for today. In the event that you missed that episode and want to go back and hear where we began with this conversation around sulfur and skin issues. My guest today is Christa Biegler. She's the host of the Less Stressed Life podcast and has an integrative nutrition private practice focusing on skin, digestive, autoimmune, and allergy issues. She also, by the way, is a super nerd, and I love her for it. It is truly amazing, all of the information that she embodies and loves to share. And so I feel really, really excited to have her here. Now, she started the Less Stress Life as a play on words for the anti-inflammatory life. She lives with her unicycling husband and kids in the rural Midwest. Christa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jen.
So I know you have a great kind of story to kick this example off, because we want to talk about the sulfur issue here. And this has played out in your clinical practice a number of times. So why don't you dive in?
Yeah, I sure will. So let's talk about sulfur metabolism. And maybe that doesn't mean anything to anyone, but if you have fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, rheumatoid arthritis, those are really commonly associated with this issue in the literature. So I had this lady come to me who had fibromyalgia, and she said that it was very well controlled, right? So she's had this issue for maybe 30 years. I think when someone's had an issue for 20 or 30 years, you know, you can chime in here too if you think, but I think when you've had an issue for 20 or 30 years and when it's kind of been a little bit crazy and hard and tumultuous, it makes what we would maybe call like constitution or like sensitivity, it makes you almost more fragile, I feel like, a little bit. And we have to kind of do things a little bit more delicately. So she came to me for a skin rash on the back of her neck. And basically long story short, so came with fibromyalgia, but didn't want help with fibromyalgia, said, I think this is fine, but has this skin rash that's really driving her crazy. So we get into things, right? We change her diet just barely. It's not really doing what we want it to do. We look at some things going on in the gut, and basically figuring out that you've got a sulfur metabolism issue, and I'll explain what it is in a minute, is kind of a process of elimination. It doesn't just say, hello, here I am. It's a process of elimination. Like, okay, so are you reacting to XYZ foods that have a lot of sulfur maybe? Do you have, now not everyone's got these resources, but one of the things that helped us figure out that this was an issue for this woman was the patterns of bacteria that were showing up. So what is sulfur metabolism? So sulfur is basically one of the most important mineral elements in the body, right? So your body uses it for all types of processes, but it needs to get converted to sulfate, basically. And so we don't want to have this hydrogen sulfide in too big of amounts. And so I think, Jennifer, you guys have talked a lot about SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, quite a bit on the podcast, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So this is supposed to be maybe like a third form of it, kind of unofficially. So we've got usually with SIBO, you look at hydrogen and methane, and this is kind of considered a different one. We actually don't really have testing for it, to my knowledge, yet. And so basically, where you're also going to see it be an issue, so this might trigger some lights on for people. If someone is treated for SIBO or bacteria imbalances, and then it pops right back, so like it seems like the symptoms go away, but they just can't ever get over it, then you would suspect this as well. Because essentially, you've got this excessive amount of sulfur that's not getting converted that's feeding the bacteria. They want to eat that sulfur. So because sulfur is supposed to get converted to sulfate via this like enzyme process, and it's not happening. That process is broken. And so basically you've got too much of this sulfur going around, and it's feeding this bad bacteria, these specific bad bacteria. And so, yeah, so maybe if you work on killing them for a while, it looks like you get better, and then it pops back and it gets worse, right? So I'm sure people maybe see a little, I don't want you to think, oh, this is me, like with this huge, I don't want you to overthink this if this isn't you, but I want you to think, hey, maybe it's more of an issue than what you realize, I guess. My point is that this is a little bit of a complicated one, right? And sometimes we want to just say, hey, I'm really complicated. And I think that can be a thing, but just kind of wanted to mention, let's talk about where you can kind of see it otherwise, right? So basically what's happening is you got sulfur. I want to clarify this because I think it's hard to I think it's confusing. So we've got sulfur. It's really important. You get it through all these foods. And actually the tricky thing is you need it. Like you really, really need this on purpose, right? It's one of the most abundant things that's in foods. It needs to get converted into sulfate with this enzyme activity, but for some reason the process is broken. Okay. So then you got things that aren't converted to the proper form. So it just makes you feel yucky, right? Very crappy, maybe joint pain, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe some other signs, maybe that sulfurous smelling gas, right? That rotten egg gas. So that helps me tell you about the foods that are high in sulfur, because the first thing that someone would consider if this was happening to them would be removing the sulfur that they're taking in. Because if you can't convert it to sulfate, you have to remove how much you're taking in to get short-term relief, right? That's not the long-term answer, but short-term relief. So this would be like eggs and garlic, kale and onions, and just cruciferous veggies, right, with sulfur. So it's, as I was starting to say earlier, sulfur veggies would be all those cruciferous veggies. And man, those are so important for so many things, fertility and detoxification. But if you can't convert them, then everything is impaired.
Exactly.
So if this is important for detoxification and you can't do it well, and that's impaired, then guess what happens? If you can't get rid of things, your skin's going to say, hey, I'll take that problem. And so
Exactly.
If you see skin issues, in addition to some of the digestive stuff, right? Of course, digestive and skin issues go hand in hand for a lot of reasons, skin on the outside, skin on the inside. But if you're seeing this and it seems like quite tricky and you've a lot of things that should work aren't working, then it might be something to just consider a little bit.
And here's one of the things too. I mean, and I always like to say this, we never want to demonize foods or nutrients at all. So the whole goal, everyone who's listening, is not to make you go, oh my gosh, I need to cut everything that's sulfur out of my diet.
Right.
That's not what we're saying at all.
Right. Nope. It's just a short-term experiment to see if it helps with some other things that I can share as well.
Exactly. And so what's interesting is that this process of the sulfur being converted to sulfate, this happens in the phenol sulfur transference pathway. Oh goodness, that is a mouthful. Phenol sulfur transference pathway. My goodness. We'll write it out for you guys so you can read it and begin to see it. For short, it's PST. And so here's the question for you. For people who are saying, wait, we've got an enzyme that's not working correctly. Do you find that this is happening as a result where this enzyme, so an enzyme, for all of you who are listening and not sure what an enzyme actually is, sort of like an oven. You have a recipe, you want to bake bread, for example, you need to bake it in the oven. If the oven's not working correctly, it might take a long time to make that bread. It might not even happen. So the same thing, when the enzymes aren't working properly, we've got other factors that are causing an issue because it is complicated. That can make the process of going from the ingredients, the raw ingredients, to the final product a bit of a challenge. And so your suggestion is, first of all, to take these foods out, these high sulfur foods. And I would assume, because that would be the case from my perspective too, is any supplements that also include sulfur in them, like MSM as well.
Yes. Yeah. And so that's kind of like one of those unknown things. That's what I do as well. And it actually knocks out tons of things. It knocks out like glutamine and some other things, because those can kind of lead down that sulfur pathway too. So it's really actually tricky. This is very much a short-term thing, right? Like the goal is, let's resolve why we're feeding this hydrogen sulfide bacteria that's causing maybe constipation, some of the things that symptoms that are common, but in this case, it's a little bit different root cause, essentially. So you're trying to take away the food, which is, the easy thing is reducing the sulfur in the diet, and then help the body convert the sulfur into sulfate and then fix the root cause. So we can talk about the root cause too as well. But let's talk about what you can do about it in the short term. And then let me put one more flag in for,
please.
For, hey, how do you know, like there are some of those things that say, hey, well, how does this make you feel? Well, then it might be a little bit of a thing as well. Mm-hmm. So if you feel like you resonate with a lot of these symptoms, so think skin issues, an ammonia smell, joint pain, gas bloating. I mean, I know some of those are common with other things, et cetera. Poor detoxification is going to lead to feeling just absolutely ridiculously awful, like beyond awful. Mm-hmm. Then if Tylenol makes you feel better, that might be a piece, because that can lower the hydrogen sulfide that's causing the symptoms possibly. Okay. So that's a possibility as well. Some people, if they take Pepto-Bismol and they feel so much better as well, that is another possible sign, because it for some reason, the bismuth in there can help with the sulfur as well. So Let's talk about the few things that you can do to experiment with this to see if it immediately helps. And then, you've got to dig deeper to fix the root cause, because you can't just live like this, right? So this is the trick. That's the trickier part. So you can reduce the overall sulfur in your diet. Now, let me also say that, I didn't discover this. This is like worst case scenario in a clinician's life. You really want things to just improve appropriately and beautifully and be easy. But sometimes this is where those wrenches come in, and you're like, this is not improving the way we would like it to. So we need to dig deeper and figure out if there's another piece. But I want to mention that I want to give credit where credit is due. The guy, I believe, who made this very popular was Dr. Greg Nye, N-I-G-H. So if you're really curious about it, you can go out and find more from the expert himself a little bit. So there's 3 key parts here to improving it in the short term. Key part 1 would be the low sulfur diet, which we already talked about. You should see a big difference in 2 weeks. Okay. So that's Brussels sprouts, onions, garlic, eggs, et cetera. I kind of mentioned some of them earlier. Okay. So number 2 would be you're missing. Remember, sulfur is not converting to sulfate because the thing in between, the link, is not working. So you got to give your body some sulfate. So you can do this with Epsom salt baths. That's just magnesium sulfate, right? But it's like crazy. It's like 4 cups in their bath, right? So it's a lot, and you're supposed to do it every day for 20 minutes. Okay. So you're doing an experiment intentionally. And I love doing an intentional experiment. If you kind of do something just barely, then don't just expect a barely result, so you need to kind of do it as recommended if you're trying to actually see the benefit, right? So 4 cups of this Epsom salt in your salt bath, 7 days in a row, 20 minutes. And then third would be to add in molybdenum. That is a hard word, molybdenum. So it's like Molly and then B-denum with a U-M. So it's MOLYBDENUM, molybdenum. Essentially, how do I describe it? I feel like there's a few things in life I'm like, how do you describe that? It's basically an essential mineral, and what I would say that's most relevant in this case is it's kind of a bridge in that missing link. So the missing link is that sulfur isn't converting to sulfate, and it helps try to bridge that. It's like a short-term or temporary bridge, essentially. The tricky thing about molybdenum is I don't believe, like in my wheelhouse, there's not really testing for that, to my knowledge, really. It's kind of like on suspicion or knowing genetics, et cetera. So like people use it for XYZ symptoms, but in this case, it kind of helps bridge things. So how much do you actually use? You're looking for 150 micrograms twice a day. So there is a product by Biotics, Mozyme Forte, that's what Dr. Greg Nye recommends, that works, but there's other molybdenum as well. So 150 micrograms twice a day. So those three things, if you don't see an improvement, then you can move on, probably, because this might not be your issue. But if that causes a significant improvement, then it's time to dig in and reverse the root. Like, why is my body not converting the sulfur to sulfate like it should? Why is the normal process not happening?
Exactly. And that's the most frustrating thing is it's like, what's my body doing? Like, why can't it get its act together and actually do what it needs to do? Because as you said, we do need sulfur, and this is even far beyond the skin. I mean, you need it for glutathione, which is really important for your detox systems. It's such an important part of many things. And interestingly enough, too, I just want to also mention that salicylates can impair this conversion as well. So if you have an issue where you really can't process salicylates and that happens in the liver, that can also be a factor in this. So it is and we know, guys, this is complicated.
This is probably one of the hardest things to describe. This is not simple.
Yes. No, and we apologize if perhaps we're throwing a lot at you, but we also wanted to get this information out there because for those of you who recognize that there may be some dietary connection, some of you may be very frustrated. You've tried a lot of elimination diets, they don't seem to work, and people don't seem to talk enough about some of these other reasons where there are in quote unquote intolerances, so to speak. So that you can have a sulfur intolerance or a salicylate intolerance, but a lot of times it's not necessarily that you can't digest them like we think of like gluten or dairy intolerance or an egg technically a sensitivity to these things. It's not like that. This is different. It's the biochemical processes in the body aren't operating in the optimal way that they need to in order to support you. And so that's where this becomes more complicated and where it can be difficult to figure it out on your own. Even when I look at the flow charts of this biochemical process, it's a lot to take in. And I mean, I'm sure, Christa, you and I both have probably had a lot of experience looking at biochemical flow charts, and so for someone to do this on your own, just so you know, don't feel like you're supposed to know this stuff. You're not. That's why we wanted to start having this conversation, because it's really important. So let's talk about some of those root causes of why this is happening.
Yeah. And I want to piggyback on what you just said there, because I think even a good clinician, even when they feel stuck, they get help from experts, right? Mm-hmm. They ask for another set of eyes. And so part of how I originally found this, it was having someone look through a history with me. Because usually if you look back through a history and you do a good job doing it, you'll start to find the holes or the patterns and sometimes you get a little too microscopic, or like if you're dealing with these issues, right? You're in the middle of it, you're in the thick of it so much that it's hard to like zoom out and see the big picture to an extent. So you got to keep that in mind. You can be microscopic, but you also have to be macroscopic and be able to look at the big picture to move it all the way forward.
Absolutely.
So I will just mention a little bit more about sulfur, and then let me talk about why this happens. So, I mean, if you think about it, sulfur intolerance was kind of this older concept a little bit, because some people they were allergic to sulfur or sulfur-based medications. You're familiar with sulfur in kind of life in general, right? I just want to like put that tangible thought there. But where are we getting this link where sulfur is not converting to sulfate? So it's thought that it could be in a couple of buckets. It could be possibly a first bucket, nutrient deficiency, primarily the molybdenum that I already mentioned, because that helps convert, that helps the enzymes do their conversion basically. So that's kind of one of them, maybe with some Bs as well. And then also, so it could be a multitude of deficiencies, but if you've kind of ruled that out, then we're looking at toxicity, which could be, so environmental toxins that could damage pathways, right? And so this is a little trickier because this could be mercury, aluminum, cadmium. So where would you get maybe some of these things? Mercury's possibly from fillings, maybe, especially if someone's had those in there for a long, long time and maybe they're leaking, right? Aluminum, maybe cooking with aluminum cans, etc. Very frequently. I don't think that you just like automatically get this. I think that you've already got a mounting problem, and this kind of like tips things over essentially, right? Like you're already weak. You've already used up some of the nutrients that help with with detoxification. And then it's almost like this just overly taxes things. And then also it's thought that possibly glyphosate could make a difference as well, or could damage that as well, which of course is a chemical that's used to kill weeds on different grains. So those are some reasons that you might have impaired sulfur metabolism. So to correct that, it's a little bit tricky, and I would say it's not simple to explain, right? So nutrient deficiencies, you can try to replete. Even a nutrient deficiency, you sort of have to back up to the step before it and say, why do you have this deficiency? Kind of like when people have a B12 deficiency. Great. So you have B12 deficiency. Why? How is B12 absorbed? All those things. So those are kind of some of the possibilities, right? This is to go over kind of like to give you an idea at first, right? And then to kind of dig into. So if someone is really dealing with a lot of issues, I hate when I have to get into this stuff because a lot of people have either addressed this or it becomes, in my practice, it hasn't been a huge issue, but this kind of makes you think, well, maybe you have to address those fillings at this point. Maybe they're not serving you at this point. Maybe they're degrading and leaking and causing issues, right? It's not necessarily in my scope of practice, right? That's when I want to make sure that you're working with someone who's really good and knows what they're doing in that way. But these are the pieces that could be at play with sulfur metabolism issues.
And I wanted to ask really quick, you mentioned sulfur drugs. Is that something, if somebody notices that they have an allergy to sulfur, is that something that should set off a little bit of a red warning light? It's
not definitive, but I can back up like this and say, overall, if you have this sulfur metabolism issue, you're going to detox really poorly. And if you notice that you're having reactions to certain classes of medications, you're not eliminating them properly either. So it's a possibility, right? How many check marks can you check, right, in the box? So it's a possibility it can contribute to it. It's not, in expert data, it's not clearly definitive from what I've seen.
Yeah. And this stuff is, again, this is complicated, everyone. And it's my hope that this will not be the first and only time that we're really going to dive into this, because I recognize for us to cram all of this into such a short format, it's a challenge. However, I think that we've given you a good frame of reference, a good overview. And then hopefully too, I always love to have guests come back because Christa is a wealth of knowledge. But I would like to continue to unpack this topic as well as a bunch of other topics that are not talked about very much. It's interesting when I look in a lot of the more common, just even eczema books out there, they really brush over a lot of these more complicated issues because it's very difficult for you guys to figure out. But my belief is if you have more access to options and potential ideas, you could then potentially ask about it. You could find someone who could help you with it if you at least have an idea that that's even something on the table, right? So for those of you listening who maybe a few weeks ago or a few months ago, whenever this podcast ends up coming out, based off of that initial conversation I had with Lily, you might have gone, wait, this is the first time I've ever hearing that sulfur could be a problem. So now you might have a better understanding of why. And I found that the more I'm exposed to something, the more comfortable I get with it, and the more I better understand it, and the more educated of a conversation that I can have. And that's ultimately the goal. So Christa, obviously, we would love to have you come back. So I hope that we can make that happen and talk about more topics like this. But I also want to encourage everybody to go and check out your podcast. I know that I have been a guest on your podcast, which I'm incredibly grateful for. It's called the Less Stressed Life Podcast, and you can find that at lessstressedlife.com. And you can also find Christa over at lessstressednutrition.com. And Christa, do you have anything for folks, if they head over there, like any good resources that you would love for them to check out?
Sure. So on the top of the website, there's a free training about the 4 things that you have to address before you're going to resolve skin or digestive or autoimmune issues. And then down lower on the website, if you have children with skin issues, there's a quick sheet on things that you should make sure you're not doing if you've got kids with skin issues that are commonly recommended in the dermatology world.
That is awesome. Goodness, you are, as I said, you are just a great mind, and I really appreciate that you've been willing to join us, and I look forward to having future conversations with you.
Thanks so much.
I hope that you kept up with the conversation. I know that sometimes it can get complicated, especially when we start talking about biochemistry. And if you don't have much of a background, it can be overwhelming. But know that this is a complicated topic. And as Christa pointed out, it can be difficult to figure out what's going on. And there are things that you can do from a functional nutrition perspective that can be helpful in supporting this sulfur pathway. I love having conversations like this because it touches on areas that we don't often hear about. They're not sexy. They're not things that you would even know to Google or ask for. And so it is really exciting to me to be able to bring content like this and topics like this that are hidden or difficult or complicated to center stage so that you know that there are more things on the table to consider. Not to panic, not everybody has an issue metabolizing sulfur, but if you suspect that you do, and some of the red flags that Christa talked about, this would be a great opportunity to then take this conversation and either dig in or talk to your practitioner about it so that they can really support you in this process, because biochemistry can be complicated. As always, you can find all of the links and where to connect with Christa in this episode's show notes. Don't forget to visit her over at lessstressedlife.com. She's got a great podcast, which, by the way, I've been on. Check out that episode. And if you have any questions or comments about today's episode, head on over to this episode's post and leave your comment or question there so myself or Christa can answer you. Also, I just want to share with you guys that I absolutely love that you're so willing to share your questions and comments with us. But if you'd love for a question to be included in an upcoming episode, head on over to healthyskinshow.com and leave a question. In the blue box, it says send a voice message to the Healthy Skin Show. There you can click on a link and share your question. That way we can include it in an upcoming episode. And hey, by the way, if you haven't done so yet, please rate and review the podcast on whatever podcast platform you are using to tune in. And thank you so much for sharing this with your friends and family and those who you believe really could use this information. In the meantime, I wish you a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in the next episode.